Well, hello everybody, and welcome to this latest webinar co-sponsored by Omdia and our partner Privado. Today's topic is discovering sensitive data flows in applications, a code scanning approach. My name's Rick Turner. I'm a principal analyst on and I cover the area of emerging technologies in cybersecurity. So all the new ways that people are addressing challenges in cyberspace, if you will. Today, I'm very pleased to be joined by Suchakra Sharma, who is the chief scientist, and Vaibhav Antil, who is the founder and CEO of Privado. So welcome to both of you guys. Hello, Suchakra. Hello, Vaibhav.
Hi, everyone. Super excited to chat with everyone today. And
hey, everyone. Super excited to talk to you as well today.
Great stuff, guys. Thank you. And by the way, from now on, you'll hear me referring to Vaibhav just as V, which is how he's known informally and to his friends. So there you go. So it's Suchakra and V. Right, let us get underway. And fabulous. Okay, this ridiculously busy slide, I apologize, but I kind of like it. And it's basically because I need to start with digital transformation. Okay, this is a discussion of data, right? Data is, what was it? The new oil, I think people were talking a few years back. I suppose now it would need to be the new electricity to be in keeping with the green economy. But you get my point. Data is everywhere and is everything and powers the digital economy. Digital transformation, I'm sorry, it's a bit of a buzzword. Not mine, I didn't make it up, but it is becoming increasingly present in everything that I do because it is a driving force for so much of the activity, both in privacy and in cybersecurity. Okay, I'm just wanting to make the point here that digital transformation is not a brand new thing. It's been underway, I would argue, probably since the 90s. I'm old enough to remember a few ads on TV back in the mid-90s when people were able to, someone suddenly remembered that it was his anniversary at the weekend. So he quickly went onto his phone, booked a weekend away, a romantic weekend away for his wife, and bought some flowers for her so he could pick them up on the way home. And that was all the promise of the digital world that was coming at us. Now, whether they actually had connectivity and whether he could actually get onto the internet from his phone at that time in the mid-90s remains to be seen. But you see, the promise was coming at us of digital transformation, and it certainly was underway by the time that we get to what in Britain anyway we call the noughties, so the early 2000s, and come 2011, dear old Capgemini, the IT services firm or an advisory outfit, and MIT's Centre for Digital Business actually come up with, they coined the phrase digital transformation. So kudos to them for picking up on what was already a trend that was underway for the best part of a decade, but actually making it into, I think the American term is, it's become a thing. And it had become a thing by then. And of course, it crystallizes in the mind of everybody come 2011 when they actually push out the term. And if anything, it's been even further turbocharged by the last 3 or 4 years of pandemic, which, of course, drove us all not only into working from home, I mean, the explosion of working from home that I'm sure you're all as painfully aware as I am of, but equally the online shopping boom. Where I'm sitting in the UK, very much, where we suddenly saw supermarkets who were just completely unprepared for delivering food to folks who had never set foot in the shop. And that's only one banal example, but essentially e-commerce that had been underway since around the millennium was suddenly the only channel that you could do. It became even more mainstream. And so supermarkets, drugstores, and of course entertainment. We all became Netflix addicts for a few years there. So what does all of that mean? Why am I bringing all this up in the context of this current conversation? Because digital transformation, everything goes more online, which means we're collecting more and more data, whether that be data about the employee, whether it be data about the customer, the end customer. And I've just put the three P's here, which is the world that I live in, which is PII, PHI, and PCI. As you can see, they stand for slightly different things. Personally identifiable information, not an easy term. Personally identifiable information. That's, your name, your date of birth, your address, your IP address, a bunch of other data that tells me who you are and where you're coming from. Protected health information stands for itself. It clearly, whether or not you've had any particularly bad illnesses, whether you've been diagnosed with anything that could be problematic in future, whether you have a chronic illness that you are continually having to deal with, what checkups you've had, all these good things that need to be accessed by your doctor, but maybe not by every Tom, Dick and Harry who's looking at your data. And of course, payment card industry data, PCI. This is just really short. PCI is shorthand for the 16 numbers across your credit card, plus the 3 little numbers on the back, and an expiry date. All of the data that would enable somebody to buy things with your credit card instead of with theirs. So essentially, all very sensitive information. And those 3 classes, you'll hear us come back and talk more about that, because of course, privacy, the privacy of these 3 Ps is key. And so much so that, given the explosion of data collection thanks to digital transformation, and again, it's totally supercharged or turbocharged by the pandemic, it's no surprise that we've had, and we are still having, this gradual increase. I don't want to call it a tsunami. That's a bit hackneyed, that term. But a few years ago, we were talking about GDPR. Probably 5 years ago now, we started talking about GDPR. The EU took the vanguard, I suppose, of privacy legislation. But the payment card industry itself has been talking about the security of payment data for a very long time, much longer than that. And clearly, it's key to enabling us to use credit cards for payments online, where we're not present with the card in our hand. At CCPA, very much the Californian, I won't call it successor, but the Californian version of GDPR, if you like. And they were a little bit the bellwether state, I suppose, where the US now has a bunch of other states who are following suit. And we'll expect to see more privacy legislation coming from other states as we move forward. And HIPAA is very much the legislation from the US, which defends or which mandates how one should protect health information, so the PHI stuff. And this is just a handful of logos I put up here. There are countless more that not even from with an English language origin. There's a bunch of others going around in different countries around the world. Globally, the privacy issue has only grown over the last decade, and of course, with everything that's gone on in the pandemic, the intensity with which this, I'm going to call it, this wave of legislation is coming at us. Okay, one of the problems of the cloud. What are the problems of cloud? Why am I mentioning cloud? Well, because of course, so much of the data is being held in the cloud now, because it's the only way with digital transformation that you can't be doing all of this on premises. And so many people are adopting the cloud, and it's been adopted so much more rapidly thanks to the pandemic, to be able to get your application functionality out to employees or to your customers. But one of the problems of the cloud is the sheer ease with which you can expand. Means that we start to get data repository sprawl. In other words, we can start seeing perhaps when it was the on-prem world, you might have had 2 or 3 databases and you could keep a fairly tight lid on them. Now, you can find that overnight you've spawned another 20 databases which your IT department doesn't even know about. And not all of the DBAs that you have on premise will necessarily be aware of all of them, because 1 or 2 of them have been created by some of your developers. So we have this problem now that there are so many more data repositories that can be spun up at a moment's notice in the cloud. And then, of course, that brings with it the risk of compliance drift. We were compliant a while back. We were compliant when we last did an audit, but maybe 2 weeks later, some of our developers or somebody in the marketing team has spun up something that they needed to be working on because they're working on a project. It's not even out there yet as a public-facing app, but they're developing this thing, and they've got a few different databases running around that are feeding into this project, and they put them all in the cloud, and we just don't know about it. In other words, these are some of the risks, and so I talk here about data leak risk even from app-to-app communications, because modern application architectures are no longer monolithic. It's not like you develop your entire application with all of the little bits and pieces of functionality that it does in order to do its job. You'll be pulling in services from other applications. Maybe it'll be a mapping application that you want for your website, so that when someone clicks on it to find out where your nearest store is, or where they go and pick something up, or where that apartment that they're thinking about renting is located. You ain't going to do that. You won't do that yourselves. You'll go out via an API, an application programming interface, to another application that specializes in the mapping. Or it might be a payment app. You might not do the payments on your website, but you'll reach out to another specialized app, typically, that will then check all the credit card information, make sure that it's me that's buying the stuff, and so on and so forth. So all of these inter-application communications only increase the risk of data leak. Now here, I've put some requirements of a privacy team. And look, you can read these yourself. I'm not going to run through them in detail. But V, I'd like to bring you in here because, I mean, you guys are privacy specialists. Your technology is all about privacy, as you'll be showing us in a minute with your own slides and your own presentation. And indeed, I think we get a little demo as well later. But V, I'd like you to talk me through these requirements of a privacy team, if you wouldn't mind. Give us your thoughts on the topic.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Rick, for asking. Yeah, so I mean, as you were talking about it, right, the starting point for if you want to do privacy right or security or data security right is kind of getting the visibility on what's happening with data. So figuring out that data map, that's kind of the, what everyone is trying to achieve. And as you were talking in the last slide, hey, it's not, in my opinion, it's not only big data anymore, it's kind of big code. So you have so much code written in a decentralized fashion because everyone cares about developer experience and everyone wants to ship the next feature fast, right? So you have decentralized team with their own tech stacks. You don't have one main database around which you can put encryption. There will be multiple services with their own local databases, own third-party integrations, right? So for any privacy or security team who cares about what happens with data or how to comply, the first really step is to build this data map, which is what's happening with personal data right from collection and where all it flows within the company, in your infrastructure and outside the company as well. Now, to your point on why this is important within the company, one could make an argument of, hey, if something is stored in an S3 bucket, you need to protect it. But another argument from a privacy perspective is of purpose drift. So maybe you collected phone numbers for a purpose of authentication, but then that can flow to a service for advertising, and that can be shared downstream to trackers and pixels like Google Ad, or any ad pixels for that matter. And that's kind of a purpose mismatch, right? That's the FTC fine on Twitter, by the way. So that is why you need to know all the flows within your company, from service to database, to protect it, to make sure purposes are adhered, and even to third parties, right? And kind of, if you have this map done, and created, what it enables you is you have the right foundation to do everything right? Because you know the data footprint, you can protect it better. If a customer asks you to delete the data, you have the list, you can do that. And then finally, the most important part for both privacy and security teams, as you said, was there is no single IT team who is manning the kind of gate and saying, a new database will be created or not. It's all happening via code, or developers have that freedom. So you need to have visibility on new code changes to see drift. So if you get a new database, and there is data going there, before it hits production, you should be able to onboard it to your data deletion service. You should be able to put access controls around it, encrypt it, so on and so forth. So the more we can shift it towards the developer workflow and fix things before they hit production, it's easier for privacy and security team. Because, remember, when you have speed, you have given speed to developers, but in the earlier days, they could only think about the business logic. But now we need to give them with speed the feedback of, hey, what you're deploying has some issues, and let's fix them before they hit production. So we need to think about building tools to help them there as well.
Excellent stuff, sir. Thank you. That makes a lot of help to me. Gives me a lot of help. Now, look it. Here is where I'm going to hand over to you completely, and I'll dive in with a few questions as we go. If anything that occurs to me, comment and so forth. But over to you. I'm handing over to you now, V.
No, that's amazing. Thank you. Yeah, so I'm just going to make the point on start from the data map that you were talking about on why that's kind of the most important thing. And if you look at that, what you're trying to do is you're trying to figure out how data gets used, right? How data gets collected, how data gets shared, stored, leaked, processed in the company, right? And if you look at the kind of challenges as a company, you'll see the first is kind of what Rick also mentioned. You have multiple services. What I like to call it is that because you're targeting speed and agility, you have data processing which is super decentralized and distributed. So you have multiple services, multiple applications, APIs, data pipelines, machine learning models, all being built super fast, all being deployed super fast. So as a company, when you're trying to map data or get to that data understanding, it becomes really difficult because where do you start, first of all? If you start interviewing people, that's going to take you years. And the problem is, let's say even if you do that, let's say you build that documentation, you talk to people, the second problem comes in, which is you have agility, you have this continuous integration pipeline setup, CI/CD pipeline setup. So the moment you manually document stuff with the next release, pretty much that gets obsolete. That's out of date. You have a new risk which has come in, right? So A, it's difficult to figure out what's happening with data. B, it's always changing. And C, the biggest problem we have seen with all the laws that Rick, you were talking about, or let's just even look at the consumer expectations. As a company, if you're a B2B company or a B2C company, it does not matter. You are making certain promises to people as part of your privacy policy or your agreements. And so as a executive, as a security leader, privacy leader, CEO, board, you are making these promises, but you don't have any governance or control bottoms up in the code where things are actually configured. So that's kind of a mismatch. So that basically leads to a combination of these three. You have less visibility, things change, and you have to make promises with less control. These leads to things which I like to call is like your product privacy violations or your source code privacy violations. And this is kind of the blind spot in the current privacy and security programs. So these are a couple of fines or non-compliance issues that we've seen over the past. And in fact, recently on the health tech side, there have been a couple of fines as well. All of them have happened because there were some data flows happening through the mobile app, the websites, the backend services, to third parties, or excessive data collection. All of that happened not because you had a breach in the company, because the way engineers built the product, there was no privacy or data security concerns built in. And again, I would like to say earlier, developers had to only think about the business logic. But now, as they're building code, as they're writing code, we are giving them feedback on if they have an application security vulnerability. We need to build tools to give them the same view on privacy and data security as well. Hey, this, you're collecting precise location and that has ABC consequences. Or hey, you're going to save PCI data in logs for error handling, but that's something we cannot that cannot hit production, right? So things like those are configured in the code, and that's something that that exists in companies today, and we need to kind of tackle that. And they are increasing because remember, the data processing distribution is increasing, so our footprint is increasing, and it's being pushed every other week. And kind of to tackle this, we have taken the age-old approach of how application security went from pen testing to SaaS, static application security testing. We are embedding privacy in the same format, wherein Privado is essentially a privacy code scanner. It would go in and scan all your applications, be it a user-facing mobile app, website, or your backend services, or your data pipeline, and give privacy and security teams complete unparalleled visibility into data and flows of data. So essentially, across the entire code base, we will go and tell you the privacy risk because of data elements. So my colleague Sachakra is going to show you it in the demo. So discover and classify personal data for each application, each service, then give you visibility on how data is collected and where all it flows. It could be to your own infrastructure like an S3 bucket. It could be on a database which is hosted on which is like a testing database, which I see a question around that. Or it could be like data leaking to logs, which you don't want because you want to minimize sensitive data exposure, right? And finally, because you are utilizing a privacy code scanner, it follows the same principles of as new code change happens, you can capture drift, you can monitor, and you can ensure continuous privacy, continuous data security as well. Awesome. And basically, what I like to call is like there are multiple approaches that you can still solve the problem. So it's not like privacy code scanning is the only one. But what we looked at is a couple of things how you can solve this problem. Like the first attempt that everyone tried to do was process. You go in, map data manually by employing consultants, doing interviews, sending questionnaires. does not really work. I mean, whoever has tried to build system architecture diagram for threat modeling, I mean, or anything, you know how quickly those documentation go out of date and how difficult it is to produce them in the first place. The second is kind of an automated approach wherein you go and try to attack the data stores. So go in and start to scan your databases, build multiple integrations, kind of work well when you're looking at data at rest, but it misses the point because it's still reactive. So you will only catch things when they've entered your database, which in some cases is late. And also, you have no control on how that data gets used from the data. Is it flowing to a third party or not? Is it being used in a service where the purpose is going to mismatch, right? The same example, the phone number was collected for authentication, but it's flowing to a service for advertising. That's a privacy GDPR violation because you promised only for authentication. So those cases you miss in data store level. So that's why we kind of propose this privacy scanning approach or code scanning approach, wherein because the entire business logic of data collection, sharing, storage, leakages is written inside the code by engineers and is being constantly being pushed as well. So it gives you a couple of advantages. A, it makes you proactive. So because you are going early in the cycle, whoever is creating the issue can also own the issue because there is very clear ownership. And second, by one-click integration, you get this data flow visibility across the entire engineering landscape. And finally, another big advantage is this is a flow which is very, very familiar to developers, security teams as well. So you kind of reuse the same processes, the same dashboard to also remediate any active data security or data privacy issues in the code itself. Awesome. And then talking about a couple of use cases on how you can leverage Privado or a privacy code scanning tool, right? So the first one is kind of a compliance or the bedrock use case of data mapping, right? What you want to do is not do data mapping, but do dynamic data mapping, which is it changes with how your code changes, how your product changes, and also generate your reports. So GDPR famously has a RUPA report, so that's something that you might be targeting. So run the scan, generate these dynamic data maps, save hours of both privacy security teams and engineers in terms of mapping this data initially, and fully integrate with all the tools which engineers use, which could be GitHub, Slack, right? So typically the first use case is run the scan, get full visibility, have your dynamic data maps. The second is finding issues in the code. So these are your shadow data flows, which no one knows in the company. Either it could be because an application was written and then third parties were introduced, and you were supposed to share only user IDs, but you end up sharing health data because the full object was sent, right? So identifying sensitive data flows to marketing third parties, trackers, preventing accidental data sharing. These are the use cases that you want to solve with your shadow data flows. And also if you are, let's say, under California, you have an obligation or GDPR to delete customer data if they ask you to do that. What again happens is you might start with a place where you might have good coverage in all your databases, but in time, as new databases are created, you want to capture them before it hits production. Before it hits production, if a new database is deployed, that should be onboarded to your data deletion service, and that is something that Privado enables. And finally, privacy by design, right? So privacy by design is something that all privacy professionals, or security by design is everyone is trying to do. And there is a component of doing it at the design stage, but with the privacy code scanning, you literally make it continuous. So as your code is changing, you can check it back to the threat assessment, which was done at the design stage, and see is it matching, and that can be automated. And also, like, for changes that were not captured in the design stage, because it will happen, there will be some code changes which will never be reviewed, and they might introduce privacy risks. So privacy by code enables you to find any security or data privacy issues in the code as code changes, give developers a feedback on what to fix, so that whatever is being shipped to production does not break any privacy laws, does not leak any customer data, and you can confidently say, hey, we're going to move fast and don't break things. And finally, this is kind of what we've seen with our customers, right? So typically a data mapping exercise in a company takes 6 to 12 months, depending on how, and even longer. We've been able to cut it down under 3 days with our customers. More than 100, but on an average, almost like data flows of sensitive data, more than 100 across third-party log leakages, unknown databases are found, and that is within minutes that we start to find. And then finally, the last piece, which is the most critical, is security and privacy teams are small, right? They're not like a big department. And what Privado enables you to do is have like a bot approach. So as your code is changing in the CI/CD, there is someone who's doing that, putting that automatic check. So like 90% saving time, because privacy and security teams can spend time on issues where or code changes where there is an issue, and the rest just pass through. So that's how you save time. You actually spend time on critical things which have issues, critical changes, and the rest just goes through. So at this point, I would like to bring in Suchakra for the demo.
Yes. So I think before we even begin the demo, we should all pray to the demo gods that everything goes well. So I'll share my screen now, and I hope you can see my screen. So I'll begin. So when you actually start with Privado, you have to link to repositories, and we work on code directly, and that's one thing which Weber was continuously saying, that why we are linking directly to the code and looking at data from the code is because code is the actual producer of data. You know, if a developer is going to write a variable username or product ID or something like that in their systems, at one point of the time when the code gets deployed in any of the environments, we are always going to get that data put into that specific object or variable. So we look at code, and just looking at code and seeing where that variable is going to flow all the way down inside, we will be able to give a nice view of what's going to happen to your data before it even gets deployed. So that's why we call it proactive. What you see here is some repositories that have already been scanned. So you see a list of repositories here, at what time they got scanned, and some information about what we found inside them. So let's look at one of them, Privado Accounts API. So the first time you click on this, you get a nice overview of what's happening to your data. And this is all done by just scanning the code. There is no actual touch of data that happens there. We are already telling you what's happening to your data just by looking at the code. So the first thing you get is a view is a big, nice diagram of what happens to your data. At the center is your repository, and then you see your inventory, which includes sharing, storage, leakage, collections. You can begin interacting with it here itself. So you can see these orange ones, they're going to Slack, SendGrid, third parties, and these ones are storage. So maybe there's something going to the database, and something is also going to logs here. So we can either look at this from the perspective of your inventory, or we can look at it from the perspective of your data elements. So data elements, again, you can view them here, or there is a dedicated board here that you can look at. So let's assume we want to look at email address. So you can click email address here, and across all your repositories, it's going to give you an overview of what's happening to your email address. But for Privado Accounts API, we can then see that there are 7 data flows which are here. So it's being used in 7 places here, and it's flowing to some place. We can click this, and it brings us back to this data elements tab. And this is an interesting view of the repository from the perspective of what data we found, how we classified it, and how we presented it to you. So here we can see that there is account name, phone number, email address, etc. Data that is there. Let's quickly look at email addresses because we were interested in that. So we can see that it's flowing to multiple places. The blue ones here are databases. So there's a user accounts database somewhere, which is where the data is either read or written from. There is third party, which is SendGrid, Slack, and a few leakages. And interesting point is also collections. We'll come back to that later. So let's click on email, and this gives you a very nice overview of what's happening to email addresses inside your application. So we see that some of them are going to Slack, some to SendGrid. The developer intended to write something, and then it eventually reads SendGrid. And then interesting point here is also these collections. So these are routes within your application. So if your application is a web app, you will see that these routes are there, and this email data is actually getting collected. So it makes sense. When you sign up or you authenticate, you're going to put your email there. So this does make sense. So one other view, which is very important from here on, is a deeper understanding of what's happening to email addresses, because this gives you a very high-level overview. It's nice to understand what happens to your data, but how do you make it actionable? So to make it actionable so that you can immediately tell a developer what's exactly happening, you can click on the code analysis tab. So when you do it, it gives you an overview of all the same places where email is actually going to Slack here, you can see. So we click on this, and we see step by step that through code analysis, we found out that we should start tracking this email. This looks like interesting. We even tell you that this is actually member of accounts, service, data transfer object, sign up. So we look at it and we start tracking it, and we see where it is going throughout the code. And eventually we see that this email is becoming a message, and going inside a Slack message, and it becomes a part of a Slack message that got sent. So inadvertently, what a user has done, a developer has done, is that a user's email, which was part of the sign-up process, they actually send it to a Slack message. So it's going to their Slack systems. And this can be a violation itself. There's a view of your data going to different databases also. So we are tracking that email again, and we see that this gets saved to some database called user accounts. And you can also see leaks happening. So the same email address, we started tracking it, and we also found out that it was getting logged somewhere here. Another interesting point we also see is collections. So collections is other places where this email address will eventually be input to the application. So this is a point where the application is collecting email addresses. So that's overall gives you a good picture of what is exactly happening to the data. And this is before even we touch the data. So you don't need to anonymize anything, go into the databases. You find this just by looking at the source code itself. What would be the behavior of the data when it flows? Another view is an inventory view. So the same kind of thing, but now you are focusing completely on the inventory. What are the third parties, your local APIs, or your databases, etc., which were there, and you can then have a view from the perspective of inventory as well. So, for example, I just want to look at Slack, or I want to look at SendGrid, like what's happening to SendGrid. So it tells you that to SendGrid, you have first name, email address, last name, and other 3 instances of data that are actually going inside it, and you get the same code analysis view, but now this is from the perspective of it's a reverse perspective. What kind of data actually goes to this third party. So after that, I'll show you a few other things. So you can actually, if you go on the repository overview, on the right-hand side, you can have more information about the repository, such as application owners, etc. And because now we know for this repository, all the data at every time any new code gets added, this repository gets scanned, and all the assessments and reports which are there, they always are updated. So you can see that you can start assessments from this as well, your traditional Rupa assessments, and you can see some are open and some are completed. So we can look at each of these assessments and try to view what is happening to these assessments. So these reports that you will be seeing will always be updated, and they will have information about whatever data elements we discovered, whatever flows that were discovered, and every time a scan hits, you will see them always there. So beyond that, you have some reports. Again, these are the same reports that I was explaining to you about, the ROPA reports. They're always updated. No need to go back to the developers all the time and ask them for each and every element, what do you have? Because you already scanned that code, you have all this information with you all the time. That essentially, and all these things, how do you define this risk as medium? How do you define this element as high, as medium, or classification of these elements? This is all completely configurable. So if you have your own data elements that you would want to actually scan, that would also work. That closes the demo. If you have questions about the demo, you can ask them, and I'll be happy to answer them. And I think I'll bring in V to chime in more information about this now.
Yeah, I think Suchakra would be good to kind of show the inventory view as well, going from the third parties and then showing what's happening inside.
Okay, yeah, sure. So we can look at these third parties. For example, here we were looking at Slack, and we can see, that first name was eventually being shared with Slack, and you can look at code analysis again here, and it's the same thing. We started tracking first name and started looking at the first name, see it flow all the way down to the Slack message itself. So that's how you were able to see data going from your start of from the start of the tracking that we were doing all the way there. We also give you information about all the places where this data is getting processed, irrespective of whether a flow was found or not. So you will see whether this specific data was processed somewhere in the third party as well. There is also a view of all the third parties across your repositories in your whole application. So in your whole, if you have like 20 repositories, for example, So clicking on data inventories and third parties, this will give you a complete view outside of your repository, a whole organization level view of what all third parties you have and where they are storing data and what is happening there. So for example, you can see here, there is one repository where fast to SMS is being used. You can quickly click that. You can see that, yeah, this is this repository that my organization has. It gives you some overview of what this third party is. Where it is hosted. You can have custom hosting locations as well. And then you can quickly drill down to 5 data flows. It tells you that you're using fast to SMS via an SDK. And then you can quickly drill down to your 5 data flows where data is going to fast to SMS. And again, like you can do this across your whole organization and look at different places. So for example, Amazon, AWS SDK is being used in search service, and there is one occurrence where this is exactly being used. And you can directly go to that specific instance very quickly. Just in 3 clicks in your whole organization, you were able to identify exactly where data is going to Amazon AWS S3 SDK. So this is an overview of third parties. Yeah. So yeah, over to you, V.
Yeah, if I could ask a quick question, V, before we get into the Q&A, I have got one quick question, which is that early on in what you were saying, you were talking about how the developers suddenly need to be made aware, not just of the business logic issues that they've been worried about for forever, but rather also taking into account, be cognizant, should we say, of privacy and security issues, which we know is not the natural domain of developers. But am I right in thinking that your technology, your platform, is designed for use by the by the privacy team, who will pick up on issues and then go back to the developers and tell them that they need to change things? Is that the way most of your customers work? They give it to the privacy team and then they go back to their developers and G them up to actually solve issues or resolve a problem?
Yeah, kind of right. So privacy and security teams, when they deploy Privado, they get the initial visibility. We also open some issues on production. So if there are any sensitive data being shared to third parties, that's a big thing right now. So health data going to tracker, that automatically creates an issue inside the Privado dashboard. We have some, so on day 0, you get some issues, then we have a Jira integration. You can directly put it to the GRC tool or Jira project management tools. And then the important part is, once you fix the house in order, whatever is in production, the second important part is drift and monitoring part. So that's where you set up policies to say, hey, if anytime sensitive data sharing is introduced, don't let it go through, or let it go through, but give this feedback to the engineer. So privacy teams have that control. And that happens right in GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket, wherever engineers are spending time.
Understood. Yeah. Okay. Well, we got a question here from Edward. Edward asks, can privacy by design use the concepts of privacy use and abuse cases in alignment with current threat modeling processes and procedures? Any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, for sure. I think that's pretty much what the privacy by design approach is as well, is basically, or it's pretty much or close to the threat modeling approach, typically doing it very early in the life cycle so that you're architecting privacy and both security right from the get-go. And typically that's the best place to start, kind of reuse the same processes. So if you already have a threat modeling process, have privacy as part of it, because that's how, if you don't add another layer, if you add another layer, that slows things down, things start to fall down the cracks. So it's kind of the best place to do it. Also because when you have 2 perspectives at the same level, your things will be better. The security team will have some privacy perspective, privacy team will have some security perspective as well from their angle. So I think, Edward, that's kind of, in my opinion as well, the best place to include both.
And I might also add something to it.
Yes,
people are already now thinking through having threat modeling processes and procedures that have already been there. So, for example, a MITRE attack framework is there, which can give you a very good overview of threat modeling. You can use it for threat modeling as well. But we are now seeing this approach being taken in privacy world as well. MITRE is actually working on a privacy modeling framework as well. And there is one which is called as SPF, Security and Privacy Framework. I'll send you the links later. So you can actually look at them, and people are thinking through this. So privacy by design concepts, they are actually now being embodied in threat modeling.
That makes sense. Yeah. Thanks for that, Chakra. That's great. And thanks for your question there, Edward. And now, actually, it's another Edward, but this gent calls himself Ted. So Ted, he asks, how can I find PII/PHI data in dev, in testing, and of course also in staging that are not easily accessible? V?
Yeah, so Chakra, do you want to answer this one?
I think one thing is that we don't really care about whether your environment is going to be dev, testing, staging, etc. So you can deploy them anywhere. We are working very, very early in the piece, in the whole chain of software development lifecycle. So since we are so early, we are just directly attacking the code itself. So you can deploy it in dev, you can deploy it in staging. It actually remains uniform. So the approach remains uniform for any of the environments that you have. And we acknowledge that in these environments, for example, in dev and staging environments, you might not have access to data. And you don't need to, because you have access to code. You can actually detect what data is going through the code, and then you will be able to understand the exposure there.
Got it. Well, look, since you mentioned you can deploy it in dev, we deploy it in testing or wherever, that leads me on to another one, which is, what are the deployment options for your technology? Either of you gents care to answer that one?
Yeah, so Privado offers a cloud and both on-prem offerings. So you can deploy Privado using a cloud SaaS model, connect your code repository, start scanning, or you can also deploy it on-premise. And then again, if you don't want your code base to go outside your cloud infrastructure, you can deploy Privado there as well. So both options are available.
Perfect. Got it. Okay. And another technical question: what code hosting platforms do you integrate with?
So yeah, we do integrate with all the major code integration platforms. So that could be GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket, and both GitHub, for example, cloud, on-prem versions of all these are integrated as well. So we support all of them, and also like the CI/CD part, like we can also integrate there. So Jenkins and I think Azure DevOps is another one. So yeah, across the development lifecycle, we have places to integrate.
Kind of the usual suspects there, really. Expected to hear those, and glad to hear that they're already all on your list of supported platforms. Now, another, even again technical, how many variables are you able to identify, and can you identify custom variables? That's an interesting one.
Yeah, so by default, out of the box, Privado has scanned over hundreds of millions of lines of code to detect about 150 data elements out of the box. And that comes, the moment you integrate, we'll start to find all those data elements, right? And whereas if you want to define custom data elements, that functionality exists as well, which means, let's say in your company, you have a unique identifier that you really care about, which won't be there in our, our usual scanning capability. You can very easily also add that. So you can define custom data elements. It's very easy to do that. But the best part is you don't need to start with that. We already out of the box come with those 150 data elements.
Right. Got it. That makes sense. And here's a bit more of a generic one, but I think this is quite an interesting one. Somebody asks, do you think that the theft of PCI data is more serious than the theft of PII or PHI data? I'll take a first stab at that. I would argue that PCI data, obviously, it hurts the most directly because it's all about spending money. It's all about, it's directly financial. So the impact of any PCI data theft or misuse of it, or of it going astray, any privacy breach of PCI data is critical. It has great impact and implications for for the finances of the people whose data has been breached or privacy has been breached. However, it must be said that PII and PHI are just as critical when it comes to a variety of other scenarios. I mean, PHI, the one that people often talk about with that is if someone is is going through an interview process for a new job. Maybe if you have data on that person and some of the illnesses that they've had in the past, that could be used for blackmail, for instance, or it could be sold to a newspaper for an expose of that person that they didn't really need to appear right at that moment. So there's all kinds of things that PHI and PII are critical as well for. And so I'd say that each of the three Ps has its place, and each of them are equally critical for privacy. Now, someone has asked, and I'd like your thoughts on this because where you're sitting and where your customers are, but the answer to Chakra, whichever you prefer. But someone asks, do you think that privacy legislation is more stringent in North America or Europe? And where else do you see such legislation emerging? I'll just say up front that my impression is that Europe got the ball rolling with GDPR in a kind of a top-down approach. The EU passed it, and then the individual countries had to put it into their national legislation. In the US, it does seem to me that it's going state by state, with a few of the bellwether states, the kind of trailblazing, and probably other more laggardly states following on. But in terms of their relative stringency, I don't think there's much to choose between, say, CCPA and GDPR. What are your thoughts on that, V or Chakra or both?
Yeah, I mean, you've kind of answered it completely correctly. Europe, I would say the most stringent, and then everyone that kind of set the baseline, majorly from a fines perspective as well. And then I would say US and other legislations are kind of catching up, CCPAs or the new CPRA, and each state is passing laws. So that's kind of I think there is going to be there is kind of convergence in terms of companies starting to care from a law perspective about data. But I would go a point ahead and say it's not just about companies, it's about customers. If someone is transacting on our website, or if someone is searching for a health service, they don't want that information to be shared with a third party, right? So even if there's no law, that could hurt your if you're a B2C company, that could hurt your brand, and that could lose you customers equally. And if you are a B2B company, that can easily lose a lot of the B2B customers. So it's about the law. It's as important about the trust factor as well, which is becoming more important. Rick, I think we got some new questions as well
let's go
on the top.
Yep, I see them. So does Privado classify data values in the flow?
Thanks for asking, Nirmal. Yes, we do. So essentially, Privado looks at, and I'm going to answer both Mike's question as well in terms of how the discovery of how are we detecting the various classes of sensitive information. So yeah, it's kind of where we are looking at the code semantics. So if a variable is there, we're looking at that. And we're also looking at how that gets transformed inside the code, which is kind of what Nirmal is asking. So essentially, someone is there is a variable email, and that gets transformed into B, and then that becomes C, and that gets logged across the data, across all of it. We are tracking that flow. It's kind of a taint flow analysis that we are doing. So we are able to do that, like the actual how that email address is transforming inside. If someone is encrypting the email address or credit card number in between, we can detect that and not show those flows as well, because those are already secured. And Mike, on the detection piece itself, on how Privado is detecting this, it's kind of three approaches that we're taking. One is a wide search, whereas it's kind of these advanced heuristics that we are doing to find anything which could be PII, anything which could be personal data for those 150 data elements. The second is semantics, which really makes the finding solid, right? So if it's an email address, it can't be Boolean. It has to be, of certain type. And then also like rolling that semantic up in terms of if a class itself is a user class, tainting the variables part of it. And finally, there is a fuzzing part to it, which is machine learning, because engineers are not going to write perfect code. So we are also, not just tracking perfect matches because of this heuristics. We have our own machine learning models where we're looking at probability of certain data elements appearing together, and that for that we increase the confidence of some bad matches as well. So it's a combination of heuristics, code semantics, and machine learning models to kind of get us a good coverage from data element classification perspective. And yeah, that's how the engine works.
Right. Final question. I think we've got time for one more. And this is a really general question, but definitely one I'd like to hear your thoughts on, V, which is how should a privacy team interact with a security team? In other words, should they work side by side on the same desk? Should one come after the other? Should they be in separate parts of the building? In other words, how do you see the interaction between those two slightly different teams with slightly different concerns?
Yeah, I mean, so great question. I would say, again, from a perspective of how we have seen that happening, is it's kind of like the perfect partnership of privacy and security together, because you might start privacy from a compliance use case or from a use case of your customers asking for the privacy information if you're a B2B company. But privacy partnering with security becomes very important, because in a lot of cases, security teams are deeply embedded in the engineering workflows, because they might be doing application security or cloud security, which means there are workflows already set in. They already might have security champions, which means reusing those flows, reusing the tooling that security teams have built in, reusing the partnerships they have for privacy becomes really important. And again, privacy security teams, they are spread thin. So the more they can consolidate, the more, and we are seeing that in third-party risk management. I think a lot of people would agree, like right now, there is not a separate privacy assessment that goes out, right? There is one third-party risk management that has a security part, there is a privacy part, that might have an ESG part as well. Similarly, privacy and security needs to work together when it comes to application privacy, application security, cloud privacy, cloud security as well.
Excellent. Well, look, I would like to thank everyone for your participation on today's webinar and for submitting those questions. Thanks to all of you folks who sent in questions. And if there are any others there that are outstanding, we will endeavour to get back to you. I'd also like to thank our presenters, Suchakra Sharma and Vaibhav Antil, for sharing their expertise with us. That was great. Suchakra and V, both really useful points you were making, and I've learned a lot. And again, thank you all for joining us, and please have a great rest of your day. Thanks one and all, and goodbye.